many people have tried, and only a few have been able to actually, establish themselves really well as, professional creators in the space. It's a really difficult job and takes an incredible amount of work. And so I do feel that now we are at a place where, of course, the industry is still changing all the time. It's super, dynamic. New things are happening all the time. It's still a very dynamic industry, but it has been around long enough that we do know that there are some patterns to it, and there are some like basics of, how the work gets done. And so at this point, like I feel that there is, more of a responsibility upon people, especially the people who are established in the industry, both on the creator side as well as, people working at brands and agencies and things like that. If you're established in this industry, I do think that there is more of a responsibility now to say, like, hey, we are a professional industry. Like, yes, it's chaotic sometimes and all of that, but we are, established professionals, and and it's time that we sort of take the reins of the industry and sort of try to shepherd it toward a pro-social future. Lack of transparency around how the major platforms like algorithms work is a huge issue. Not only is it a professional issue for people who make their livings on these platforms, but it's also obviously a wider social issue because it's prioritizing certain types of content. We don't know everything about this space, but we know enough. There are patterns here, like we know that there's potential for misuse of our data and, sharing or leaking of data by social media companies. We know that that certain types of harmful content are sometimes prioritized by the algorithms. And so we know that there are negative things happening. So there is, a lot of potential for, again, like negative impact. And so it is, the responsibility of, in the case of content, visibility and things like that, it is sort of incumbent upon the platforms to get a handle on this thing. And it seems like they have been sort of behind, and it's sort of been almost like a PR response, like after a scandal has happened or after something horrible has happened, then they kind of scramble to try to patch it or something, when I think that, again, we're at a phase where people who, this is their job, they are the experts in the space, they need to do a better job of anticipating the problems instead of scrambling to fix them after something has already happened. But in the case of, influencers and creators, this is like a huge uneven power dynamic between the creators who are totally dependent on these platforms to make their living. And they also bring a lot of value to the platforms. A lot of people get on Instagram and TikTok and things like that because they're looking to, they want to see the content from the people they follow. And a lot of the people are, professional influencers and creators. And so these people are bringing a lot of value to the platform, but platforms don't have a lot of responsibility back to them. Again, it seems like platforms sort of like jump up and say like, no, we care about you when something has happened. Like I think back to like the Black TikTok strike and sort of waves of outcry that happen over Instagram, over the course of years. And, people saying like, oh, I'm getting shadow banned, or I'm this or that, or I'm done with Instagram, I'm moving to TikTok. Instagram has really, there's been a lot of ups and downs over the last few years for Instagram. And when those moments happen, the platforms kind of say like, oh no, like we're gonna, we're starting this creators fund, or we're I remember Instagram doing like the creators week like a couple years ago and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yeah, that's all well and good, but why are you doing this now? It feels like you're doing this after we've kind of been yelling and screaming about the problems that we're facing. And I would like to see a more consistent accountability on the part of the platforms to the people who are really dependent on them. How precarious the work can be, for creators, and always having to be like anticipating changes and diversifying your income streams and stuff like that. Like I think accountability has just not been a priority because it has been a pretty chaotic industry, and influencers kind of tend to work alone, or they might have a team, but it's not like going into an office every day where you're part of like a massive, organization. It's kind of atomized, the way people work in the industry. And so yeah, because of these like structural things going on with the industry, I think it just hasn't been a priority for a long time to sort of coalesce around a mission or around shared norms or ethics and and things like that. So I appreciate what like the AIC is doing, and other professional groups. Like I know the ANA has sometimes has like some conversations about this and stuff, as far as trying to bring people together a little bit more, and like foster conversations across the industry about what are we doing, what are the right paths forward, how can we educate people about what's going on and the sort of like ethical ways to do business in this space, and how do we kind of envision the future that we want and get there. And so I appreciate that those conversations are happening, and I do feel like the industry is sort of at a turning point. Like I said, it's like, I don't know if it's like moving out of its adolescence or something like that, but it's like approaching maturity. I hope that there is more, I guess, like professional identity building, or solidarity building, call it what you want, but a little bit more of cohesiveness forming, and more conversations about prioritizing accountability, prioritizing ethical business decisions and things like that. Always been, and authenticity too, have always been like really salient topics that have like captivated people. And but for a long time, they were thought of as sort of like these lofty concepts, and something that was like really appealing, but also maybe something to be feared. Is this person going to use their influence, somehow influence me for evil, or something like that. And then over the course of the 20th century, roughly, we see it sort of shift from like these sort of lofty philosophical ideas to things that are thought of that can be sort of captured and studied and sort of grabbed onto a little bit more. And so that is sort of like part of the groundwork for the influencer industry that exists now, in the social media age, is like this long history of thinking of shifts in how people thought about influence and its role in society, and how it can be like measured, and who is influential, and how can we pinpoint what makes them so, and what counts as influence, and all that. All of these conversations were happening before computers, even before the internet. But so that just kind of goes to establish like how important they are in society and how important, how critical they have been in thinking about how to communicate over time. And they, obviously remain very much so. And in the beginning, in bringing it up to, current times when we're thinking about, the influencer industry broadly understood, in the beginning, say around 15 years ago, the idea of influence was still kind of like rough. It's like, oh, okay, this person has a ton of followers. Like they are influential. I look back in the book at like these early services like Clout and things like that, I think services like that were actually really important for sort of like normalizing the idea that like we can measure people's digital footprints and call it influence, but obviously it was much rougher then. It was like, oh, they've got a lot of followers, that must mean they're influential, or something like that. And but over time this shifted, and obviously the tools for measuring and evaluating influence have become much more sophisticated over the last 15 or so years. But over that time, the idea of influence has also gotten a lot more complicated. It's no longer enough, and it hasn't been enough for a long time, to just have a lot of followers or to even just have a solid engagement rate, because there could be hundreds of others very similar to you, working in your same sort of space with the same similar sort of metrics. And so that is when we see the concept of authenticity become even more important, right? Because that is how a lot of brands and marketers and other people whose job it is to sort of evaluate influencers and select them for campaigns. That is something that they're looking at a lot to sort of differentiate, who should we choose? We have a whole list of people who have similar metrics, so then it becomes, who is the most, who seems the most authentic and who feels the most authentic to us as a brand partner and things like that. And so, yeah, so it is, it's just become, extremely, extremely complicated. And these ideas of sort of influence and authenticity have been sort of like swirling together in this space for years. And it's impossible to untangle them at this point. And influence and authenticity have always been leveraged to get messages out to people, and they've always been sort of critical to effective messaging and persuasive messaging. And so I think that influencers today should sort of recognize their place in sort of this long history of people who have been in the position of being persuasive in society, and again, use that position for good, to the best of their ability, and recognize that they are in this sort of, unique, but because of, the forces of time and history and our place in history and how things have changed, like they happen to be in this sort of right place, right time, where they do have this platform, and that they do have a lot of potential, as well as, the responsibility to use it well. People who are knowledgeable about the industry, people who are working in it or reporting on it, or, those kinds of things, for people like that to sort of throw up their hands and say it's a Wild West. I do think that has become a cop-out, like I said, we have evidence of patterns in the industry, whether it's, the basics of how it works, how the business of, doing brand and creator deals works, the basics of, measuring and monetizing influence. Yes, the specifics change, but, we kind of, we get what everyone's doing, we know that the working conditions for influencers and creators can be really, really taxing and difficult, right? To work in this space means, a lot of challenges with mental health, dealing with, not, criticism, yes, but also sometimes more extreme to, harassment and cruelty and things like that coming in your comments and the DMs and things like that. you're navigating this really opaque space where, you don't have a lot of transparency about pricing. There's so much uncertainty about how much to ask for, so much uncertainty and lack of transparency, again, around algorithms and how the platforms are operating and what's it going to look like tomorrow and next week. Having to sort of make yourself vulnerable, but also monetizable, dealing with, inequalities related to, race and gender and economic inequalities and things like that. We know, there there has been a lot of research and reporting and, firsthand story, sharing, things like that. So we know that these things are going on. And we also know that some people do exploit the influencer system to, spread misinformation and or harmful ideas about body image and, things like that. Like we know, no, like, again, no, of course we don't know everything, but we know a lot. And so, we know enough to say this isn't a Wild West, and that for people who are involved in the space, especially people in positions of leadership, at the platforms, at major agencies, at brands and things like that, it is their responsibility, to work to limit the harms and foster the good. People who use the term are either not informed enough about the industry, or they have something to gain by keeping it, a Wild West, by being able to say like, on the platform side, like, oh, oops, we didn't realize that this type of, harmful content was being surfaced, or we didn't realize that this level of harassment was happening, or things like that, because it's such a Wild West, or on the brand side of like, oh, we don't know like what's fair to pay people, and things like that. Like, people who are using the term at this point, I would say it's a little bit of a red flag, and we need to move beyond it. I think the Disclosures 101 is like a very, very helpful document, but speaks to the broader issue of like the need for more professionalization of the space, right? Because especially I think people maybe who are just coming up, maybe like not really making a living, just sort of like aspiring creators, I don't know how likely they are to say like, oh, I better go see what the FTC has to say, or, I better make sure that I'm doing all this above board. There are so many people out there who are like creating content and, maybe doing so professionally or not quite professionally yet, but hoping to get there, who I think like maybe it doesn't even occur to them, or maybe they are saying, oh, I'm just not going to do that because I don't feel like it yet. And so I think that speaks to the problem that you're, trying to address with the AIC, which is like further professionalization of the space, further public knowledge about the space too. And that is definitely something that came up in my conversations with people, is their feeling of being misunderstood and their feeling of being sort of maybe like condescended to, or, not taken seriously, and the sort of need to educate their followers more and more too about like what they're doing. And I think that also works to like bolster their authenticity too, right? Where like they're sharing a little bit more behind the scenes of some of the stuff that they deal with, and things like that. And I also spoke to a few people who quit the business because they just couldn't deal with either. Some people talked about how they just couldn't deal with like the negative blowback constantly, and like feeling like they had no like support in doing the work, and other people just feeling like it was too much of a challenge to navigate like the constantly changing space, and like changing technologies and changing norms, and just feeling like I've had enough of this. There was a lot of talk of like people saying like, no, I want people to understand that I'm like an entrepreneur, or I want people to understand that I'm not just influencing people to buy things, but I'm trying to like build like a larger business than that, you know? And I do think that, but again, I think that because people tend to work, you know, in sort of silos a lot of times and try to sort of cobble together support networks in various ways, that kind of that does make people feel sort of isolated, I think, in doing the work. And so having more spaces where people can kind of come together and talk about the issues they're facing and strategize for the future and things like that, would be a huge, you know, benefit to the public. And also for, you know, the professional groups involved in the space to do a little bit more like public education about what is going on would go a long way to helping, I think, helping improve the working conditions for people working in the industry, and also helping just the people who are following and encountering the content, better understand, you know, what it is. Like you said, we know what an ad is now, but that we didn't always know what ads were. You know, that was a whole other, you know, social, you know, moment in history, you know, like, you know, 150 years ago or so. Like that was another moment where it's like, oh, ads are a thing, brands are a thing. These new media technologies like radio and television, well, we're going to have ads on them. Well, what is the significance of that? And what's that going to do to us? And, you know, these are conversations that have happened over and over again throughout history as technology changes, as media changes. People who are parents now, most of us did not grow up with social media. That came, you know, maybe later teens, 20s, that sort of thing. And so people who are parents and teachers now, like, are, you know, they don't fully understand what it's like to grow up with access to these platforms and content and that sort of thing. So I think talking about it is, you know, extremely important, and not just kind of handing kids a phone and saying have at it, you know, having these conversations, and again sort of dispelling the mystique of, you know, of platforms and creators and things like that, and can go a long way. Yeah, and that, you know, transparency and accountability, I think, are really number one, and educating the public as well, so that there isn't such like fear around the industry. And I think like the concerns are absolutely well founded. I have concerns too. They're all in the book, you know. But again, like sort of yeah, just sort of prioritizing professionalizing the industry, and establishing it as, you know, again, a cultural industry that exists in society. So how are we going to educate the public about what the industry does, and ensure that the industry again acts in you know, for social good, and rather than, you know, damage. Yeah, so the book is available, you know, wherever books are sold. You can order it on Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, from the publisher, Princeton University Press. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Emily ADH and Instagram at Kiki Hund.